In the last 50 years, 1.2 million Tibetan people are said to have died under Chinese rule.
I think Tibet is part of China.
One of the world's most ancient cultures is on the brink of extinction. But does anyone really understand the Tibetans?
This whole kind of notion of Tibetans being like peaceful or non-violence, you know. Hello, wake up. I mean, this is not the case.
And does anyone actually have a clue what's going on? Tibet, one of the most magical places on Earth. Birthplace of the Dalai Lama, though he no longer lives there. Over 6 million Tibetans and some of the most spectacular scenery on Earth. Where on earth is Tibet? On the other side of the world, crammed between two of the world's biggest countries, China and India. The Tibetan Plateau is a massive area to the west of China, about the same size as Western Europe, covering nearly 1/3 of the whole of China. But since 1965, the Chinese have decided that the bit of Tibet they believe in is quite a lot smaller, and they call it the Tibetan Autonomous Region. Lhasa is the highest capital city in the world, centre of Tibetan spiritual life and the nearest thing Tibetan Buddhists have to Mecca. And slap bang in the middle of this city of God is the empty home of the Dalai Lama, the Potala Palace. But these days, Tibet is a messed up place. It's an ideological battleground and a police state. Officially part of China since 1949, but integral to the Chinese national psyche for centuries longer, for them, it's as much a part of China as Yorkshire is to Britain. Of course, the Tibetans don't quite see it like that. As far as they're concerned, they are not Chinese, never have been Chinese, and never will be Chinese. For centuries, all Tibetans have been Buddhist and worshipped the Dalai Lama. And they really take it seriously. 7-year-long pilgrimages are not for the faint-hearted. The Chinese, on the other hand, don't trust religion. They want to show Tibetans that a modern future is nothing to be frightened of. Hold on tight to bumpy ride. Since the 13th century, the Chinese and Tibetans have been fighting each other to decide who's boss. Like all good neighbours, they've had rows and they've made up. They've had marriages and they've had divorces. They've even had uninvited guests. In 1904, the Brits dropped in for tea. But they didn't stay, and by 1947 they'd legged it, leaving the two old adversaries at each other's throats. In 1949, while Europe was being carved up after the Second World War, the new Chinese Communist government hatched plans to grab Tibet once and for all. And in a spectacular piece of spin, the Chinese set about what they called the peaceful liberation of Tibet. Not that the Tibetans had much choice about it.
Chinese have actually attacked on a very vulnerable bunch of people who were unarmed, who were peaceful. And they knew that it was going to be an easy task.
After a short, bloody battle, the Tibetans surrendered and the Chinese took over. So the Chinese control Tibet. But who's controlling the Chinese? And what about the Dalai Lama? The Dalai Lama is the spiritual and political leader of the Tibetans. He's also 2,500 years old and on his 14th body. Basically, he's like Doctor Who. When he dies, he just gets reborn into a new body. Simple, really. He's also just about the most popular politician in the world.
Lots of Tibetans in Tibet, they want, once in their lives, they want to actually have an audience with the Dalai Lama.
He is the embodiment of the Buddhist god of compassion, like his archenemy who didn't have a religious bone in his body. Chairman Mao Zedong. Despite pegging out nearly 30 years ago, his hold over the Chinese is almost as strong as ever.
When I think about Chairman Mao, I think he's great because without him, China couldn't be as civilized or have this sort of much better degree of freedom nowadays. And of course, there is no foundation of People's Republic of China.
people take Chairman Mao as a very important person during the whole process of China's development.
The current boss of the People's Republic of China, Hu Jintao, is regarded as a modernizer. But the spirit of Chairman Mao still haunts almost every aspect of Chinese daily life. So that's who to look out for. Now, let's get back to 1950. With the Chinese in control of Tibet, they started to make some changes, and that didn't make the locals very happy. In fact, by 1959, they'd had enough. Monks all over the country went out on the streets to protest against the Chinese. The Chinese weren't interested, and to shut the Tibetans up, they bombed Lhasa. More than 2,000 Tibetans were killed, and while the Dalai Lama himself escaped death, he heard a rumour that the Chinese would be back to get him, so he fled to India. Hot on his heels, more than 10,000 Tibetans followed. With the Dalai Lama out of the way, the communists could get on with their plans. The first thing they tried was called the Great Leap Forward. Serious communism.
The Great Leap Forward was a kind of fantasy idea of Mao to regenerate modern China, and it resulted in mass starvation across China, which hit the Tibetan borderlands particularly badly.
Millions of people starved in China. In fact, more people die in China in that period than die of starvation in the rest of the world combined in the 20th century. It was a catastrophic famine, partly caused by incompetence by the Chinese government, partly caused by flooding and drought in various parts of China, and not helped by the fact that the Americans embargoed all grain sales to China, which meant the Chinese couldn't purchase grain from overseas.
But Mao wasn't finished yet. And 8 years later came the Cultural Revolution. A whirlwind of youthful violence aimed at ridding China of everything old, except Mao, of course, and replacing it with a shiny new nation, more powerful than the West and free of tradition, history and religion.
In a place like Tibet, where everything depended on tradition, on ritual, on religion, it meant that all the kind of outward symbols of being Tibetan were physically destroyed.
They may not have been trying to kill anyone, but the communists were giving Tibetan monasteries a proper kicking.